Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. So we've been seeing the lives of Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret through the marvelous book, Elizabeth and Margaret. And it's been a pleasure to learn about them and to make videos for my channel. So let's see what we can find out today. Queen Elizabeth didn't want to tell Margaret what to do regarding her relationship with Peter Townsend, and a close friend of Margaret said the Queen was absolutely determined that nobody should influence Princess Margaret over her decision and that she should be free to make up her own mind. Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth make a trip. They went to Australia and New Zealand, and they would be apart from their children for 6 months. When they left the airport, Margaret promised to take care of Charles and Anne. The sisters were crying at the separation. Princess Margaret felt lost and lonely without her sister, and she couldn't talk to her mother about her relationship because the Queen Mother was acting like an ostrich and hiding from the matter. Peter proposed to Princess Margaret, and she accepted, and they hoped the wedding would take place on August 21st, 1955, because by then she would be 25 and could make up her own mind about whether she wanted to marry him or not. Peter was reading his Bible in Brussels and discussed theology with a Catholic friend, and he took up amateur horse racing. His highlights were getting letters from Margaret and his boys. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip traveled over 43,000 miles by sea, air, and train. The Queen gave 102 speeches and was introduced to more than 13,000 people. Queen Elizabeth was a professional. She carried her index cards with listings of names, titles, occupation, and anecdotes involving the dignitary she was going to meet. But an embarrassing incident happened during the trip. A camera crew was outside, scheduled to film her looking at wildlife at the O'Shaughnessy Reservoir in Victoria while they were staying at a chalet, and when the door opened, the cameraman started to film. About this time, Prince Philip dashed out and was being chased by his angry wife, and she threw a tennis racket and tennis shoes at him. The Queen saw the filming crew and got Philip back inside and slammed the door. The Queen's secretary demanded the senior cameraman to hand over the film, and he did, and the Queen appeared to them, and she said to the film crew, "I'm sorry for that little interlude, but as you know, it happens in every marriage." Once the Queen returned home, she had a lot of things to do, and the most important thing was how to deal with Margaret and Peter Townsend now that they had a year apart. Peter had followed the rules and not tried to return to see his two sons, and with the Queen's permission, in July of 1954, the couple got to enjoy a brief reunion. When they got together, they talked for 2 hours and laughed as if they had just seen each other the day before. Townsend later stated that our joy of being together was indescribable. Their love had not dwindled, and when Peter had to return to Brussels, Margaret still missed Peter dearly. When it was Princess Margaret's 24th birthday, they celebrated at Balmoral. The Queen Mother wanted to maintain the tradition of dressing up and singing a specially composed song for her, just like they did when the King was alive. The Queen wasn't sure this was a good idea, but she didn't want to spoil her mother's fun. Princess Margaret was in tears because it reminded her of the times when the King and Peter were there. Princess Margaret got the flu around the holidays, and the Queen felt that she should spend February in the Caribbean. It was thought that the warm climate might do her good. And the trip was a success. Thousands of people turned out in the heat to see the princess, and she didn't mention Townsend's name once during her month there. When she got back to London with a tan, she was fit and healthy. Now we come to Margaret's 25th birthday. So when the big day came, Margaret was rowing across Loch Muick on the Balmoral estate with some friends. She and the rest of the family were like prisoners on the 40,000-acre estate. The place was surrounded by 300 or so reporters and photographers. They wanted to see if she would sacrifice her position, her family, her faith, and her fortune for love. And the Daily Mirror said, "Come on, Margaret, please make up your mind." So Princess Margaret sat down and wrote the reasons for and against their romance. The for reason was, "I couldn't live without him," and against, because it does harm to the Queen. Margaret wrote to the Prime Minister to be polite, and she outlined her future intentions. In a handwritten letter, she discussed her short-term plans, and she anticipated the response of the media and articulated her feelings for Townsend. And she was going to see Townsend in October during his annual leave, and the meetings were to see if their love was still there. She wrote in her letter, "But by seeing him in this way, I can feel properly to decide whether I can marry him or not. She said at the end of October or early November, "I very much hope to be in a position to tell you and the other Commonwealth Prime Ministers what I intend to do." The Queen, she said, knew she was writing him, but of course no one else does. During this time, the Queen, the Prime Minister, and Princess Margaret worked together to resolve the matter to the satisfaction of everyone. The Lord Chancellor, Lord Kilmer, gave his view about the 1772 Royal Marriages Act. Prime Minister Eden stated that the act probably didn't apply to Princess Margaret because of the contradictory drafting. He felt that 75% of the electorate would be in favor of the marriage being somehow allowed. And during the weekend, the Queen and Princess Margaret discussed many topics, but Princess Margaret was the main topic. Prime Minister Eden met with Princess Margaret and said that there were limitations of the Royal Marriages Act and suggested that if she still wished to marry Townsend, the best approach would be for her to write to the Queen on her own initiative, saying so, and renouncing her right in succession to the throne. Parliament could then legislate in compliance with her wishes. Princess Margaret accepted this, and she told them she was still uncertain. One thought that if she gave up her position, she would be cast out, shamed, but she was informed that she could keep her title and her civil list payment, which would increase upon marriage from £6,000 to £15,000 a year. She could keep her royal duties and her appellation, Her Royal Highness, and in the future Townsend would possibly get a title and his own allowance. The only sacrifice she would have to make was that she would have to remove herself and her children from the line of succession, but that wasn't much of a hardship because she was third in line after Prince Charles and Princess Anne. And another stipulation would be the marriage would have to be a civil ceremony. It would be the case if she were a royal or a commoner. Queen Elizabeth was said not to wish to stand in the way of her sister's happiness. Peter Townsend was working on a plan to arrive to London unnoticed. He had planned to drive to La Torquette in northern France and then cross the Channel on the air ferry to Lydd in Kent. He thought he had outfoxed the media, and he had only mentioned the plan to a few friends, but when he got to Lydd, he was blindsided by flashbulbs. He got in his car and went to London. The media was following, and he went to 19 Lowndes Square in Belgravia, and he didn't answer any questions, and he stayed put. On October the 13th, Margaret returned from Balmoral to London by train. The Queen asked Margaret to continue with her official duties, and that the lovers not be seen out in public, and that they met either at Clarence House or at the home of friends of the royal family, and Margaret had no problem with that. She went to Clarence House and phoned Townsend to confirm her meeting that evening. Peter got there and went in the back entrance. Townsend followed a footman to Margaret's sitting room, and the footman left, and then Margaret walked in, and they hugged each other after a year apart. Townsend said that time had not staled our accustomed sweet familiarity. For decorum's sake, the Queen's advisers asked that they spend just 2 hours together before Townsend was let out. The next meeting place for them was Allen Bay Lodge. Helicopters and light aircraft circled above the mansion, and the streets were jammed with people. Later, police and dogs were brought in to seal off the estate. One friend later stated that Margaret, when she was with Peter, they seemed so natural with each other. The friend said you couldn't doubt that this was a once-in-a-lifetime love, and one that everyone dreamed about. Peter adored her. The book Elizabeth and Margaret said that it may have been wishful thinking, because Margaret was no longer sure of her feelings. She wanted to test the waters, and she felt that Townsend had changed. He was now 40, and he was in a dead-end job, and obsessed with being an amateur jockey. On the surface, they seemed to be happy with each other, but to her biographer she said, "How do you know after 2 years whether you want to marry somebody?" Time was wasting because the longer it took to make a decision, the more it hurt the monarchy and the Queen. Townsend said that during this time, both he and Margaret were exhausted mentally, emotionally, and physically. 10 days after the reunion, Margaret joined her sister, mother, and brother-in-law at Windsor Castle for a difficult weekend. When the Queen Mother asked how Margaret would manage, Prince Philip said she could buy a house. The Queen Mother didn't like that and stalked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The Queen Mother hadn't been told the plan by Prime Minister Eden and how they would try to give Margaret a soft landing. Peter later said that she did not say what had passed between herself and her sister and her brother-in-law. No doubt the stern truth was dawning on her. Townsend and Princess Margaret met the next day after her talk with the family. She felt she was thoroughly drained and demoralized. 11 days after the meeting, they decided they couldn't continue. Townsend sat down and drafted a statement saying why they should not marry. In the brief time reuniting after a year, they felt their love no longer burned as brightly as it had in the beginning. When Princess Margaret read what he wrote, she said she felt the same way. They had reached the end of the road. During the tumultuous times, they made an informal pact that if they couldn't marry one another, that they would not marry anybody. There were outside influences, but the decision was theirs and theirs alone. The Queen gave Margaret the opportunity to make her choice without undue pressure. They gave Margaret everything that would allow her to follow her heart, but the Queen sought to make it clear that she and Margaret formed a united front, sisters together. Paul Reynolds said the Queen and Prime Minister Eden were working to facilitate Margaret's romance with Townsend, not destroy it. It was a myth that she was made to give up her fighter pilot lover by the Queen and her advisors. The Crown that kind of got that myth going on, but it wasn't true. But it was hard to admit publicly that they had simply fallen out of love. And Princess Margaret drove to Lambeth Palace to see the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Geoffrey Fisher, and she told him, "I am not going to marry Peter Townsend. I wanted you to know first." The Archbishop was beaming with a smile and said, "What a wonderful person the Holy Spirit is." In the end, Margaret made a decision of faith. After she made her statement, she spent the evening alone at Clarence's house. The Queen Mother didn't say goodnight, but Queen Elizabeth called the princess for a brief conversation. And there may have been a few other reasons that Princess Margaret had doubts. It was thought she was seeing someone else during their time apart. He was a group captain that looked a lot like Townsend. And then one point, Carrie Fisher said that her father, Eddie Fisher, and Princess Margaret had an affair around the time of the separation, too. So it's no wonder she had doubts about Peter once they were together again. Well, this episode sure was eye-opening because I was going by kind of what the Crown had said, that, they kind of made Princess Margaret give up Peter Townsend, but that wasn't true. Everybody tried to help her as much as they could to see that they could get together. But time had passed, and they no longer felt the same about each other. So I think Princess Margaret made the right decision. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you.